you used a credit card, it was roughly 100 to the dollar. And if you went to the blue rate, exchange your cash, it was 200. And now it's even worse. It's like 150, 300 or something. But it kind of boggles your mind, because you think, oh, I'm going to take money out of the ATM and go do my thing, pay with a debit card or whatever. No, you don't want to do any of that. You need to have cash.
Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of Chat with Nomads. Today we have with us a long-term traveler and award-winning travel writer, Tim Leffel. Hi Tim, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Rex.
Yeah, I heard you're in Colombia right now, so thanks for hopping on despite the difference in time zone that we have. There is a lot of things that I want to talk to you about, and I've decided to narrow it down to something that I thought would be really interesting and really speculative, especially based off the books that you write. So before we dive in, why don't you give an introduction of yourself and what you do, because you've been traveling for so many years, right? So the audience can have an idea on when we speculate, what's your background and where you're coming from.
Yeah, so I'll try to skip over the middle part to keep it interesting. But I started traveling in 1993 with my girlfriend, who's now my wife, and we went backpacking around the world, kind of a typical path through Southeast Asia, Nepal and India, and Turkey and Greece, and up through Europe. And we really enjoyed it, and didn't want to stop after that first trip. So we took two more trips around the world later, and we taught English in a couple of places, in Korea for a year, actually, so closer to where you are. And then I started working as a travel writer along the way, just doing articles for magazines. And then, the internet opened up more options. But long story short, I became a travel blogger eventually, and, moved beyond just doing things for print, and then started writing books. And the one I wrote first was called The World's Cheapest Destinations. And now it's out in its 5th edition. So it's been revised many times. But that was kind of the book I wish I'd had when I took off traveling, one that would sort of give me the quick overview of the best bargains out there. And so it continues to sell because people keep taking off every year, except for the pandemic times there. But and then my other one that is relevant to this is called A Better Life for Half the Price. And that's about moving abroad to save money and have a better life at the same time. So that's in its 2nd edition now, because I updated it. Actually, that was my pandemic project. 2020 didn't make much sense to be writing travel articles. So I thought it would be a good time to interview people over Zoom, because everyone would be easy to get hold of. So I updated the book then with some new interviews.
Yeah, that's interesting, because this podcast was also started during the pandemic, because I realized it was way easier to get travelers by then, because people are not like traveling all around. I was not like going all around the place. So it was easier to kind of schedule time for it. And that was how it started as well. So you mentioned that it has almost been 3 decades since you first started traveling, right? Because that's 1993, right?
Yeah,
so
I'm not a young guy, obviously.
Well, but you have a whole wealth of experience in travel, right? And when you just now mentioned in just a very brief introduction, you have obviously seen the change in a lot of stuff. You have seen in terms of travel publications going from print, where I think like even in my era, which was like more than just a decade ago, the guidebooks that we were using were really Lonely Planet and stuff, and it was the physical book. Nowadays, it's almost never that. It's like you just find information online. And so you saw the publications going from like print to digital. And I think within the last 30 years, another big change that happened in the travel scene was really the rise of budget airlines across the world, particularly in Asia, because I remember when I was way younger, it was never that cheap to travel until like maybe a decade plus ago, when budget airlines started launching in Asia, right? And then we are starting to see some of it in South America. Of course, Europe is huge on it. US, I think, was one of the first to start having budget airlines, but then we still have countries like Africa, continents like Africa and stuff that's still harder to get around via the air route. But throughout the years, we have seen a huge change in different things. And I think in the last 2 years, there's 2 very big changes that we are seeing, and it's very relevant to the 2 books that you have published. One being, as you mentioned, The Cheapest Destination Around the World, World's Cheapest Destinations, right? So that constantly change, but I think as travel gets easier, there are more options. The other one is really talking about a better life for half the price, which is the whole rise of the nomadic movement and remote work, right? And today I'd like to speculate a bit about the new state of travel, because I think in the last 2 years since the pandemic, a lot has changed for travel. What really sparked this was that a few weeks back, I think I was just scrolling through Instagram. I saw Nomadic posting something about the price of hostels being extremely crazy, especially this summer, right? And everyone is talking about part of it is because people were so confined within their home for the last 2 years, and everyone just wanted to travel when summer came. And with the rise in oil prices because of global movements and events, the price of travel has actually skyrocketed this year, I would say, right? And we were talking about whether you will ever go back to pre-COVID levels of prices, right? So from that aspect, let's start talking about this cost of traveling first, because I think this applies to all travelers, regardless if you're a long-term traveler, you're a short-term tourist, you want to try and get the best bang for bucks, right? So just as a general overview first, what do you think, what's your take on this in the change, and what will happen moving forward?
Well, I do think a lot of what happened this summer was just kind of a temporary blip. You know, gas prices went up and everybody was traveling at the same time. And yeah, I mean, a lot of hotels were trying to make up for lost time. You know, they didn't have any business for a year and a half. So, of course, they're going to charge as much as they possibly can if they can fill up the place. But, you know, there was a lot of people had savings, you know, people were saving their money for 2 years and they were ready to spend it and go on vacation. But you know, they're going to be back to normal here soon and putting it on their credit cards and whatever. So, you know, that can't last forever. But yeah, there were a lot of ridiculously priced hotels all over the world, like here in the US too, just because, I mean, I'm not there right now, but when I was in the US, I was seeing ridiculous prices at places. But I was in Spain this summer and it wasn't too bad. And I was in Bulgaria and that was quite cheap. And like you said, there's a lot of things offsetting that. When prices do go up in one area, they kind of come down in another. And you're right that we have loads more airline options than we used to have. And I flew to Colombia from Mexico for $142 on this airline called Wingo. And that was with checking a bag and having a seat selection. You know, they get you on all those extra charges. But even with all that, it was $142 one way. So I was pretty happy with that. So yeah, we're starting to see some budget airlines in South America now. And there's a few in Mexico. And so, yeah, it's spreading all over the place. And of course, you can fly around Europe super cheap and lots of places in Asia, like you said. So that offsets it. And I don't know, there's just a lot less friction in travel. So maybe that doesn't save you so much money, but it saves you a lot of headaches, you know. So a lot of things are easier than they used to be. But I think in dollar terms or euro terms or whatever, I don't think prices have really gone up that much since I started backpacking. I mean, if you adjust it for the price of inflation, you know, and what people are earning, I think it's still pretty easy to go backpacking around the world on the cheap if you pick the right places. I mean, it's not going to work if you're going to Amsterdam and Paris and Singapore and Japan, but you know, there's lots of bargains out there beyond that. And maybe look beyond hostels. You know, it's hard when you're single, but if you're traveling with another person, a lot of times it's cheaper to get a real hotel room than to stay at a private room in a hostel. And of course now we have Airbnb, which also didn't exist, 10 or 12 years ago. And so, you know, that's opened up other options that a hotel or hostel's those are not your only options. You've got other places you can stay. And just one last note on that. Sometimes you can stay for free. I mean, there's you know, there used to be couch surfing, but now it's sort of evolved and there's house sitting and other things, you know, so home exchange, all kinds of other ways to get free accommodation, or the travel hacking, which I know you've talked about with other guests, like, you know, you can't fill 365 days with that, but you can use some hotel points to get some free stays here and there.
Yeah, for sure. What was interesting, you touched on a lot there, and I think what was interesting that caught my attention when you're talking about budget airlines was that just before the pandemic happened, a lot of the European budget airlines were actually trying to bridge the flight routes between Europe and Latin America or South America specifically, and that would have cut costs by a lot for the travel industry in general. But then obviously with the pandemic just coming through at that time, a lot of them started to pull back because obviously no one was flying, all the airlines were bleeding money, and then they decided that, hey, we're not going to focus on the expansion and we're going to protect the territories that we have. And they started to basically remove all the routes that they just started building. So that was really a kind of a pity, because when I saw it, I was like, oh, this is good, man. Like, it's going to be so cheap to travel across continents by flight. Because I do a lot of land travel. Like every time I reach a continent, I usually fly into the continent and I start traveling by land throughout the continent. But so cross-continental travel is where flights cannot be avoided. And obviously, flights tend to be one of the more expensive travel options if you're not flying budget. So that was quite a pity, but then I'm definitely looking forward to them building up again, and hopefully we get more cheap flights.
Yeah, I have noticed that a lot of those routes that disappeared just from the regular airlines have started to come back again. And some new airline launched recently, I think it's called North Atlantic or something like that, launched this year between Europe and the US. So, and it's a, budget airline flying from Germany to the US. And hopefully they'll go beyond that if they do well, we'll see. But I was encouraged just to see something new popping up.
Yeah. When I first went like on my long trip, I flew budget into Europe from Asia, and one of the biggest airlines that's part of Singapore Airlines is called Scoot. That's the budget arm of it. And when I first started, they only flew to Greece, and so that was when I decided that, hey, it's so cheap now to fly to Europe. And then when I just got back, now they have direct routes to Berlin now, but they now have connections for you to fly via Athens or Berlin to other parts of Europe as well. So you can get a relatively cheap flight to Europe. So we are really seeing the expansion of the budget airlines. But I definitely agree with you on the hostel or traveling by yourself kind of thing, because I started to realize, because I usually travel alone, I started to realize that when you travel alone, one of the least worthwhile thing is really accommodation, in the sense that a lot of private accommodations are built for 2 pax and above. So even if you are 1 pax, you book accommodation, is usually 2 pax worth. So you are basically paying for two persons worth of costs, although you're the only one staying there.
You get penalized for traveling solo.
Yeah, so I used to rely on hostels a lot, or I still rely on hostels a lot, but as I start moving into a more nomadic lifestyle, there's also a bit focus on like getting stuff done. Hostels are not always, or like not really hostels, but more like shared dorms are not really the most conducive environment at times, right? So that's something that we are definitely looking at. I'm wondering about Airbnb though, because it used to be one of the biggest accommodation platforms, I would say, for travelers and nomads. But then during the pandemic, obviously they pivoted to almost like local travelers, because they had to work within their own market, right? And in the last few months, through the travel groups on Facebook and stuff, I seem to be seeing more complaints about Airbnb having like sky-high prices that are no longer worthwhile. And I'm definitely starting to see the trend that people are looking past Airbnb to find other platforms that are coming up. And like you say, there are now house exchanges, trusted house sitters, all those kind of stuff. Do you see any trend in this direction?
Well, there's a couple key things to know about Airbnb. One is they don't have the same rules across different countries or even different cities, because sometimes, a city will make them pay the same taxes that the hotels are paying, or there will be some other, different kind of tax or fee or whatever. So that all gets factored into the price. And then, of course, you have some hosts that are charging way more for cleaning or whatever, but I think what important thing to remember is, I know you've probably had other guests talking about this, but slow travel is a lot cheaper than fast travel. So if you could even get an Airbnb place for 1 week, it's usually cheaper than the nightly price. And then if you get it for 2 weeks, it'll be less. If you get it for a month, it'll be less again. And that's just baked into the pricing. Like that's all automated, where, people will automatically discount 25% for a week or 50% for a month. And then of course you can negotiate beyond that, or try to, but at least that part of it's built in. And I think you just really have to be flexible in all these things, with the airfares and everything else too. But the more flexible you are, the better. So in some markets, an Airbnb place is going to make more sense, especially if you want to cook a lot. But in other places, maybe you go to Vietnam or Thailand, you're not going to cook anyway. So, just get a hotel and don't worry about it, because hotels in Vietnam are a terrific bargain, so why would you even look at an apartment? Because you can also go outside and on the street and get a good meal for $2, so you don't want to cook. It's going to cost you even more to cook than it is to eat out.
Yeah, that's definitely one thing to consider about accommodations on deciding, be it hotel, hostels, or Airbnbs, right? There are like pros and cons to it, and for Asia or Southeast Asia in general, most places, like you say, it kind of doesn't even make sense to cook anymore because the street food is part of the experience as well. The whole culture is in the street food, so you do want to try that, and they're like really cheap. So it makes no sense to really kind of cook too much, whereby so the kitchen is kind
Right.
of useless.
I've talked to expats that live in those countries, and all they have in their apartment is like a little dormitory fridge, like you have in college, because they hardly keep anything in it, just some fruit and some beer. So everything else they're buying out because they're just letting somebody else cook for them. So they don't even have a kitchen half the time.
Yeah, yeah. The other thing about Airbnbs or apartments is so that I don't know if I'm the only one that have this concern or issue, but it's always that I feel when I stay in a hotel, I'm okay. It's not that I make a mess out of everything or anything, but when I stay in the Airbnb, I'm more cautious about not making a mess. Like I will always almost clean up before leaving because I mean it's someone's house, right? So you're like, okay,
And
I'm
they're
going
going
to
to
clean
review
up.
you. That's the other thing. A hotel's not going to
That's
review you.
that's true, but the hotels it just feels more like carefree. Like although I don't hold
Yeah.
parties or anything, but I wouldn't really bother cleaning up after a hotel. Like I stay and check out, I just leave. Whereas in the apartment, I tend to spend like the like half an hour before I leave to kind of like make sure okay everything is in order and stuff. I wouldn't be like leaving stuff all over the place. Do you have that concern as well when you travel?
Yeah, a little bit. And yeah, because with a hotel, you automatically have someone there that's going to clean up every day. It's just part of the service. Like they have housekeeping. It's a big part of a hotel labor pool is somebody to clean up all the rooms. Whereas when you're renting from an Airbnb, they've got to pay somebody to come in when you're done, I guess, and they are gonna review you. They're gonna if you leave a big horrible mess, they're probably gonna say something bad on your profile.
That's true. That's true. So let's talk a bit about flexibility in travel because I definitely agree with you. And I think that is almost like a given answer or main factor in being able to travel cheaply, regardless of like the time you're traveling or regardless of the current scheme of things, the environment, right? So as nomads, I think there is a lot more flexibility in travel because you're traveling long term. But I'm just wondering, like for say a regular traveler or tourist that doesn't have as much time, right? What are some tips that they can practice or some thoughts that they can have in order to keep the itinerary as flexible as possible so they can still take advantage of like cheaper prices somewhere and things like this? Because for example, although I travel long term, but sometimes in certain places I like to move around quickly, like Western Europe, for example. Like there's no point spending like a month in Paris or something because that's super expensive,
Mhm.
right? So those I tend to move around quicker, and sometimes I book stuff like extremely last minute. Like I will book the accommodation for the day only on that day in the morning. I'll find the accommodation for the night only in the day, and that's the time when you get like a lot of discounts suddenly popping up because they're trying to sell off the accommodation for the night. So,
Right.
what are some ways that regular travelers can try and take these into account to cut costs while traveling?
Well, I think that's smart in a lot of ways because also if you book too far ahead and something goes wrong, your flight doesn't make it or your bus doesn't make it or whatever, and if it's a non-refundable night at the hotel, you've just paid for something you're not using. Like in the old days, we would just show up in town, like pre-internet. You just showed up and started looking around, and that could still work if you want to do it. But you can also call hotels directly and try to especially for staying for a few days, try to get a better rate because then they don't have to pay booking.com or Expedia or Agoda or whatever. But anyway, I mean, there's this creativity writer that used to be popular. His name's Roger Van Oaks, and he had this saying that was always look for the second right answer because usually, when your first one doesn't work out, there's a better answer. You just have to keep looking. And I think you brought up the example where you could fly from Singapore to Berlin, so maybe you had no desire to go to Berlin. You really wanted to go to France or Italy, but take that flight and then get a train or get a bus or something, and I always tell people to look at alternate airports, especially for Europe, because things are pretty close together there. So maybe a flight to Sofia, for example, is really expensive, but you can get one to Istanbul for super cheap, well, then just take a train up from Turkey, it's not a big deal. And I think that's true in a whole lot of markets. And also flexibility on dates is super important. Maybe, you know, if you come 2 days earlier or stay 2 days later, you'll get a much better rate. And, you know, same with hotels. If you're going to arrive right in the middle of when a festival's going on, you're probably not going to be happy with your price of, you know, lodging. But if you can come 2 or 3 days later, it'll be a different story. And so I would just always tell people to not be wedded to, you know, the exact plan you have in your head, because if you can change it a little bit, you'll probably be much better off. And I think that's more of an issue with vacationers than it is with people like us, because they haven't traveled much and they don't know instinctively to start looking for other answers. But I think for us, it's kind of built into our nature that if we see a price that's really high, we go, okay, what can I do to change this?
Right, right. And the other thing about, I think that might not be a very common knowledge among people who, let's say, don't travel as often, is that there are certain hubs or airport hubs in specific continents that are really great to fly from, where it's always the cheapest. And I'll say it's not as much as the distance travel versus the connectivity of an airport hub. So for example, if you look at South America, the hubs to fly in and fly out of are generally like Sao Paulo in Brazil, or Lima in Peru. So those are hubs whereby flights come in and usually at cheaper prices. Even Bogota, or I think Medellin in Colombia, are also good hubs to fly in from or fly out of to Europe. And that applies to every single continent. I would say there will be specific cities whereby flights are cheaper, and you want to try and search within the city. Like in Europe, it'll be Frankfurt, Istanbul. Those are bigger hubs. And as you start playing around more with the, let's say, the Google Flights map, you start to realize, oh, okay, now I need to plan according to this. And if you can get that right, I think you can start saving a lot of cost, because you can base off your flight prices and your travel plans off of a transit hub.
Yeah, I think that Google Flights map is a beautiful thing. It's so helpful because you basically can put in your starting point or your end point and leave everything else blank, and it will tell you where all the deals are. And just, you know, the hubs example you brought up, like if you wanted to fly from South America to Europe and you checked, you know, let's say from Santiago, you know, you might find terrible deals, but if you check from Sao Paulo, you might find a flight to Portugal for $300, you know, so it would make sense for you to end up in Brazil instead of in Chile when you're doing your South America trip before you move on. So, yeah, I think it's really important. And I mean, I'm still amazed all the time when I look at that map, you know, how much of a difference there is even between cities that are right next to each other. You know, it can be double the price to go from one place than to the other. And sometimes they're only 3 or 4 hours apart by car, you know, or by train. So you won't know that until you start looking.
Yeah, I think it's when you approach it with a mindset of like more of a gamification and exploration, it gets more and more fun, because you start looking and you're just trying to dig for that hidden gem whereby, hey, this day is particularly cheap, or this place I can do it this way, and now that it's like way cheaper. And if you deploy it to
here's another weird hack too that I've had the last couple of years, and I don't know if this is going to last. It might have just been a pandemic thing, but I've flown business class 3 times now between the USA and Mexico, because the flight price was only $40 or $50 difference, and you get to check bags and you get to go to the lounge and everything. So it's kind of a no-brainer, you know, when you look at the price difference, because you're going to have to pay to check a bag anyway if you want to. So that's one other thing to maybe bring up. Don't automatically just check the very cheapest flight options, because sometimes there's not many business travelers on the road still. So sometimes you can get a better seat for not much more money.
That's interesting, because I'm actually curious to see this trend as well, because now, because due to remote work, a lot of companies are saying that business trips are definitely going to be cut short or cut down permanently for the foreseeable future, right? So I think that definitely leaves a void there to be filled, right? Like if there are more business class seats or first class seats, how are airlines going to play the game of pricing, and whether like typical travelers can actually take advantage of that? So of course, I think like you mentioned, now it's still a bit too early to say, but I'm definitely interested to see like in the next few years what's the trend on that side of things.
Yeah, for sure. And obviously if you can work your way into elite status somehow, then that's great. But I never seem to manage. I managed like twice in my life because I'm never flying on the same airline, it seems.
Oh yeah, that's the thing as well, right? Like if you are stuck to one airline, the bad thing is then you have limited sort of routes and pricing. But whereas if you're open to all kinds of airline, suddenly like you can also, so it also balances out. It depends on whether you get more savings being loyal and flying very frequently to get either the elite status or the savings of it, or versus like you're just more hacker based and just try and find the cheapest rate at any point in time with whatever airlines.
Yeah, I think for most of us, it doesn't really pay off to be loyal. But if you have a job that flies you around a lot, then it does. Because then you're getting more perks out of it.
So speaking of flights, and I used to be more of a backpacker style traveler when I was still back in school, and I was like the poor fellow that just tries to hack every single way. And so it was literally about traveling cheap in the sense of like a absolute cost kind of cheap, right? Like whatever doesn't cost the most money, that's what I'm going for. But I think as you grow older and you are making money along the way, you are not really constantly looking at cheap in the sense of absolute cost, but what is the most worthwhile price to pay in the sense of like my output versus maybe what I get from it, or the time savings I get from it to be put into business or work or other things, right? And I was speaking to a lot of nomads. One of the things that certain nomads do, especially when they look at flights, is that they are no longer spending a lot of time trying to find the cheapest flights. Because, for example, I could be spending a whole hour trying to find the cheapest flight, right? And maybe I find a flight that has 2 transits that transits in 2 different areas versus a direct flight, and the savings maybe say $100.
Yeah.
And they will feel like I should just take the direct flight, because even though I pay $100 more, but I save that much time and maybe I'm more productive at work, or I have more time to put into other stuff. How has that kind of changed for you throughout the 30 years? I mean, because you have been, I'm sure at the start, you're also more focusing on that. And then like, what's the difference nowadays?
Yeah, there's some hotels I stayed in my early backpacking days that I definitely would not want to go back to now. You look for a little more comfort as you get older, and my wife's even pickier than I am. But one great example, though, for what you just talked about is trains in India. Like the difference between, a third class train and a first class train, air conditioned express, whatever, it might be double the price, but we're talking like $6 or $12, when you double the price. And so it's such a worthy splurge to spend that extra $6, especially if you want to get some work done. Because if you're in third class, people are going to be selling you stuff. You got to watch your belongings. You definitely don't want to pull out a laptop. But if you're in first class or on the express train or whatever, you're going to be with business people, so it's perfectly normal. And so I think it's really important to look at those situations. And also, I've noticed on a lot of these budget airlines, the difference between the worst seat on the plane and the best seat on the plane is, $10 or less a lot of times. Like you can get the exit row by spending $6 or $8 more than, the worst seat in the back of the plane. So, why not just shell out a little more money? It's not going to take you much longer to make up for that if you're working. So, I agree. Like the direct flight thing too. It's certainly worth it to pay a little bit more to save 6 hours of time that you would have spent just going through that other hub.
Yep. When you mentioned about the trains in India, that definitely brought back memories, because I did try the third class cabin before, like an overnight train just between 2 cities. And fortunately, it was just an overnight train, because it's like when you board, it was like you just don't know where you're sitting. Like no one knows where they're sitting. Everyone's just going to like the freaking empty spot. Yeah, it's like a free for all. And then the whole night, the sand was flying through the train door and going into your face. And then you're like, what the hell is happening right now? But luckily, it was overnight. And then after that, I took a trip across the whole of India, from basically Bangalore down south all the way. I was traveling up into Nepal. So I decided that, well, because I was also poor at that time, so I was like, train is a good option to try and cut across. And that was like a 2-day, almost 3-day trip, I think, if I remember correctly. And luckily that we booked like a better class, and it wasn't the best, but it was definitely like, it was okay. Like you can survive there. Like at least you get like a proper seat, or where you're sitting and stuff. And the people around are like families and stuff. So it's also kind of safer in some sense as well.
Yeah, definitely safer. I took pretty much every class there is there, I think. And so I experienced the very worst and the very best. And there's a huge difference. And I don't think anywhere in the world is as stratified as that. Like, the local third class trains, like not the overnight ones, it's just complete mayhem, It's like, people passing their babies through the windows and bringing animals on, and you don't know what you're going to encounter.
Yeah, that is definitely some crazy stuff. Let's look a bit at the other new progression we are seeing in the travel space, right? And we move on to your book of A Better Life for Half the Price. So of course we spoke about how regular travelers can travel properly, can travel in a more cost-effective way. But the other trend that really sparked off this in the last few years was the digital nomads, right? Like, and with remote work being more prominent, more people are looking into this space. You have been traveling for 30 years, but you also set up a base in Mexico, right? And that's your current base. So
Yes.
when do you decide to move into such a lifestyle, or why base yourself in Mexico? Because I reckon back then the concept wasn't as, popular, and moving off to another place was almost like less heard of for a lot of people.
Yeah, but it wasn't really much of a big deal. I mean, I was working as a travel publisher online, and so my business didn't really change that much, and you can do phone calls, as long as you're in a relatively similar time zone. You can do phone calls and people don't even know where you're calling from, and so I feel like it doesn't matter a whole lot where you are, as long as you have a decent internet connection and a good desk setup and whatever. But I think what has changed is far more jobs now can be done remotely than when I first started doing this. Even back in 2018 and 19, there weren't so many people working remotely, but after the pandemic, that all changed, and a lot of people realized they did not want to go back to an office, and so they started looking for a way to keep working remotely, if not all the time, at least part of the time. And so I actually went to this. I was a speaker at this event this summer called the Bansko Nomad Fest in Bulgaria, and if you had something like that 5 or 6 years ago, I think everybody there would have been either a blogger or a graphic designer or a freelance writer, or something that was sort of like a creative endeavor of some kind. Maybe a few Amazon FBA resellers and things like that. But now, man, people are just doing every kind of job you can think of. They're managing real estate companies, and they're doing hedge funds, and you name it. It's like all these people with regular jobs, as we would call them, are out there living abroad wherever they want and just doing the same thing they were doing before, but remotely.
What made you choose Mexico as the destination in that case? Like, because I know that you also tend to prefer to travel to places that are firstly less explored, and secondly cheaper, obviously, right? So
yeah,
what made you decide on Mexico as a base, and when did you base there?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really see the point of moving from the USA to England, for example. Like, you're going to spend more money than you were before, so that doesn't appeal to me unless somebody's going to offer me double the salary that I'm making on my own. But so I want to move someplace that's less expensive so I can have that better life for half the price. So people call it fancy things like currency arbitrage or whatever, but the whole idea is you're just earning in dollars or euros or pounds or whatever, and you're spending in a country where your money is worth a lot more. And that's just purely economics. You're making more than the local wage most of the time, which is how it all works. But I picked Mexico mostly because of proximity. It was very practical because we both have parents that are alive still in the USA. And, I'm still going back for conferences and business meetings and whatever. And, we thought about, so first of all, I didn't want to move all the way to Thailand because I was still running a business that, required regular communication. And I didn't want to take 2 days to get home, if something happened with my family. And then at the same time, like, I really like Argentina. I could live there in a heartbeat, but it's really far, to get from there all the way back to the US, and it's expensive, where the flights are. Whereas flights from Mexico to the US are almost the same as flying across the US. They're pretty close to domestic flights. So it's no big deal when we want to go back to the US, or if I want to go to a conference or go on some press trip or whatever. So a lot of that was practical, but it just happens to be a place where I really love the food and I love the culture. And the city we live in is this historic UNESCO World Heritage City that is older than the USA is. And so I like that sense of history too. And so it's very easy for us to just step across the border and feel like we're in an exotic place, that's completely different. Canada doesn't feel so different for us, but Mexico surely does.
Yeah, the culture is definitely like very different in Mexico, and it's a very, I'll say, colorful and passionate culture. That's
For
actually
sure.
one of the first destinations that I've traveled to that is furthest from my home when I first started traveling, and that kind of really kicked off the wanderlust for me as well. So that's definitely a good country to be in. But
And it's not the
the
cheapest. I just want to add, like, there are certainly cheaper places to live in Latin America than Mexico, but it's a pretty good, it's still a really good value. And so I'm very happy there.
what do you think about? So this is a bigger topic of things, right? You were just now talking about the Nomad Fest in Bansko, Bulgaria, which is almost one of the bigger events in the Nomad community every year. And lately, in the last, I would say 1 year, the Balkans has been springing up as a destination or a whole region that's really focusing on trying to target digital nomads and remote workers. And I have a series speaking with some of the change makers, I would say, in Croatia that's trying to push this particular region as a nomadic destination. So we are talking Montenegro, Albania, those kind of stuff, right? And these countries also recently just started launching digital nomad visas. So, but what we have seen is that before the Balkans, I would say maybe we talk about 5 years ago, it was where the first batch of digital nomad hotspots kind of sprung up. So we are looking at places like Bali, Chiang Mai, Medellin, right? Lisbon, Portugal, even, right? So these places were sort of the first wave of nomad hubs. And then looking now, almost 5 to 10 years in, we see a bit of the change in the whole environment and prices due to, of course, foreigners going in, right? And prices are rising. Obviously, like Portugal used to be a very good place for investment. I would say now it's just expensive as well. Still much cheaper than other
Especially in
parts of Western
Lisbon.
Europe. Yeah, especially in Lisbon. Even the government changed the elite visa to try and bring more dollars into the less touched spots in Portugal. So being based in Mexico, what's your observation on this thing? Because obviously Mexico is also another huge spot with Playa del Carmen, Mexico City, Cancun. Those are places where people like to hang out and nomads like to go to. So do you see prices increasing more than inflation? So not due to inflation, but more caused by the influx of nomads and tourists. And what do you think is going to happen with like some of these destinations in the next 5 years?
Well, first of all, in these bigger cities, I think this is kind of an overblown story in some ways. Like, I mean, Mexico City's got 20 million people in it, so if 500 more foreigners move in, it's not going to make much difference. It tends to be one specific neighborhood, that gets more gentrified faster. And I think the same thing has happened in Lisbon. The most popular part of the historic center is where a lot of expats with money have moved. And so then all of a sudden the neighbors freak out, because their rents are going up. But the thing is, rents are going up everywhere, like, I don't know if you can necessarily pin it on a few Silicon Valley workers who moved in and weren't afraid to pay $4,000 a month for an apartment. But, I mean, rents are going up in the USA like crazy. And it's not because anyone's moving in. It's because we don't have enough housing that's reasonably priced. And so, and inflation, has been a real thing, of course, but I think there's two problems they're combining. There's the housing situation and there's inflation on top of it. But the thing is, I would just encourage people not to cluster and go where everybody else is going. Like, I think if you get outside of Lisbon, an hour or two, you'll still find incredibly cheap prices in Portugal. But everybody goes to Lisbon and the Algarve and maybe a little bit to Porto. And then beyond that, nobody's moving there. It's like they're all going to the same spots. And it's sort of the same in Mexico. There's more of them because it's closer to the US. But there's like 4 or 5 cities where everybody goes, and then they don't branch out much beyond that. But it's a country with 22 states or 30 states, I think. So there's plenty of other options out there. I understand the appeal of being around a lot of other expats, especially if you're starting a business. Chiang Mai is a great place to go if you want to mix with other people that are doing the same thing. I think the tropical MBA guys call it the freshman dorm of nomad life. because like you go start out there and then you move on. But I do think we'll start to see people moving on to some of these other countries. I mean, I think in Bansko there's like 150 foreigners living there, and it's not a very big town, maybe 5,000 people. That, as far as the permanent population, and again, it's not enough to make a dent, but there's enough people around to support a co-working space, and to have meetups and go hiking together and things like that, if that's what you're looking for. But yeah, I think some of these places in Croatia and Montenegro and Albania will start to catch on because there's such a screaming bargain. I mean, even if you go just look at Airbnb prices for monthly in Tirana or even some of the beach areas in Albania, it's ridiculously cheap. Like you could not find a shoebox for that amount in most American cities, And so it's for a nice penthouse apartment with a view. So I think that just the economics of it are going to make those places take off. And, they're they've got a lot going for them. People just don't know much about them. I mean, there's fantastic beaches in Albania. I'm going to go there next summer for a while, actually. But Americans get a year too. It's like Georgia. You can go in for a year and not even have to apply for any kind of residency or digital nomad visa or whatever. So it's pretty hassle-free in that extent, to that extent, if you want to live in Europe. So we'll see. I hope people get a little more creative and start checking out these other places. I know there's been some action in Madeira and, some certain spots in Romania and whatever. But, as long as after a few people start the ball rolling, then it tends to snowball.
Yeah, I'm seeing the same trend it's almost like travel, right? Like a country or a particular city or place could be a hidden gem when you first visit it. And then after that, because also of the prominence of social media, obviously the snowball starts rolling and rolling, and then the place gets extremely crowded after that. For example, Croatia, I think, was a very good example in the sense that a decade ago, Croatia was like the hidden gem, seriously. And then obviously Game of Thrones, and then of course people going and then visiting places like Dubrovnik is extremely crazy in the summer. Like you go there and it's just lots of tourists, right?
They've actually scaled back the number of cruise ships that can dock, and that helps a bit. But yeah, it's crazy crowded there in the summer. And it's funny. I don't know if you remember back this far, but like the original hotspot was Prague. Like after the Iron Curtain fell, and communism stopped, like all these expats moved to Prague and started teaching English and whatever they could do to like make money. And then Berlin got hot, like it's just sort of places have their day and then they get too expensive and everyone moves on, it seems like.
Yeah, I'm always having this issue of like between the nomad expat and the traveler soul in me. Like as a traveler, I want to visit less touch places, where you can get more of a local vibe and local feel of things. Like even taking Mexico, for example, I spent like a few months in Mexico in 2010, and I started from the small town of Querétaro, which is like in the middle of like the country, 1.5 hours or 3 hours from Mexico City, right? I thought that, granted that was the base that I was using, but that's probably where I really got a lot of the local cultural elements compared to, say, the more I go towards the Yucatan Peninsula, towards the beaches, the less I get the Mexican vibe, the more I get the resort tourist vibe,
And so the prices go up accordingly.
Yeah, the prices go up as well. But back then it was still really cheap. Like 10 years ago, Mexico was like really, really cheap. I would say almost like the prices you can probably find in the Balkans in terms of European standard. That's how cheap it was for Latin America as well. So the thing about the Balkans is also that I always feel like now is the best time to go because they are still not as invaded yet by like tourists, and so the prices are cheaper, and there are still places that are less touch and worth exploring. Like for example, Moldova. No one goes to Moldova, but if you go to places like Moldova or Kosovo, I think those places have a lot to offer. So you for people like me, when I go there, I look weird. Like kids will be looking at me and they're wondering like, why is there a person that looks like that? Right. So those are the places that are still relatively new and untouched. But a lot of the Balkans, they're obviously trying to go into the EU. Apparently, that's like the thing. Like everyone wants to go into the EU. And when they start going to the EU, obviously prices are going to go up. And coupled with like the movement of travelers and stuff, I think some of these places are starting to get the prices will keep increasing. So it almost feels like a race to always be in front of the pack in the cluster. Like you want to discover the hidden gems first before anyone ever goes there.
Before it gets ruined, I'm using air quotes here, just because it doesn't look the same anymore. But you got to understand there's a trade-off too. Like, maybe the place isn't as clean, and it's kind of hard to get around those countries in the Balkans. There's not some easy tourist bus system to get you from one place to the other, and train system's awful. And so you do make some sacrifices in those places too. And so it is a bit of a trade-off. But yeah, I mean, and sometimes people complain that like, oh, this place used to be so much cheaper. But that's good news for the locals because it means they're making more money. Like that's why it's not as cheap anymore. They're not making the terrible salary they were, and they can afford more. And also more of them can afford to stay in their own country. Like there's this huge phenomenon in Europe where people from Bulgaria, Romania, the Balkan countries, they go work in Germany or France or England because they can't make enough money in their home country. So if things start improving for them and job prospects are better, sometimes that is because of tourism, then prices are going to go up. That's just a natural progression.
Yeah, it's a very
otherwise you're Bangladesh or Pakistan that never seems to get any richer.
Yeah, it's a very interesting balance. But I would say one of the places that I always thought like everyone should visit, and we spoke about it, and it's still, I think, still relatively untouched and will never be fully touched, is India. Like I think that's the place that you'll go and you'll always be able to get. If you're willing to go into like the local side of things, you'll always be able to find a local side of things.
Yeah, it's like another planet there. If you want to get an exotic experience, go hang out there for a while because it's nothing like what you've experienced in your life.
Yeah, for sure. And you should definitely go when you're younger because I think it does take a toll on you physically and mentally. Right. So
actually, we've talked about that a few times, my wife and I. We talked about, oh, would you like to go back to India? And she's like, I don't know if I have the energy anymore.
I myself don't know even if I have the energy, so I can imagine like you have to think a few times about it. But there are still places like Varanasi and stuff that I have not been yet that I really want to go because those are so deep into the culture that I think I regret not visiting at that time because now I feel like I have to go back and see it.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm capable of that. I saw a lot and I loved it. I mean, there were some fantastic experiences, but every day you feel like you're going into battle with the touts and the people that are trying to rip you off,
So when we spoke about like, so you have this book that is the world's cheapest destination, right? And being in the 5th edition, what do you think is the biggest change throughout the few different editions? Did the places change, or were there certain elements of price consideration that changed a lot throughout the years? Did the criteria of judgment change, or what's your experience with like from the 1st edition to the 5th edition?
Yeah, well, my criteria was pretty much the same through all of them, which was basically, is this a place that a single person could travel on, let's say, $40 or $50 a day, or a couple could travel on like 60 or 70, 75. But beyond that, it was also, are there things to do there? Is it worth going to? Because there's lots of cheap places where there's just nothing to do, and so you don't want to go there for 2 or 3 weeks or a month. But yeah, things have changed over the years. And what's interesting, a few countries have come in and out a couple of times, namely Turkey and Argentina, because, at times they've been cheap, at times they've been expensive. And a lot of that depends on how their economy's doing and whether they're having a financial crisis and the exchange rate and all those kinds of things. And actually Mexico wasn't in my first few editions. And then because the exchange rate kept getting worse, it ended up making the criteria later, although it's probably the most expensive one in my book because just getting around is not as cheap as some of the other countries. The buses are really nice, but they cost you more. But yeah, and like the Czech Republic I have in there as an honorable mention because if you get outside of Prague, it's pretty reasonable. But if you go to Prague, it's crazy expensive. It's like going anywhere else in Western Europe. And so that one's kind of funky. And, there's a lot of countries like that. The whole urban rural divide is a big deal. And you talked about Bali earlier. Like, I feel like 95% of the tourists that go to Indonesia or nomads that want to live there go to Bali, and then there's this whole vast other country that hardly anyone visits. It's just nuts. And I traveled around there a lot when I was backpacking, and there's so much to see and do, but people are kind of like lemmings. They all go to the same place, and I know for Australians it's kind of like their quick holiday place, because there's not many
Because they're
places they
far
can
from everywhere
go.
else. Yeah.
There's not many places they can go where they can get to in less than 8 hours. And so they all go to Bali.
But you brought up two very good points here. I think one being that sometimes it's not just about looking on the country level, because when you hear about a certain country and when people talk about it, it's usually the tourist hotspots, right? If you talk about Spain, it's
Right.
like Madrid, Barcelona, and stuff like that. And like you say, if you talk about Czech Republic, they're talking about Prague. And if you talk about Hungary, people are only talking about Budapest, right? But outside of
Yeah.
Budapest, there's so many untouched areas that are not that Budapest is very expensive, but in some sense, there are places outside that are way cheaper and there's a lot more local atmosphere to it they can enjoy. So sometimes it's worth like not just dismissing the whole country based on what you hear from maybe the capital city or the tourist hotspot, because there are other areas that you can explore, right? And the other
Yeah.
point was really about currency exchange, because obviously I think Argentina is an example that I'm very familiar with, having spent like a year plus there. We talk about the blue rate being like almost two times
Yeah.
cheaper than the official rate, whereby there's this market or black market, or not really in some sense, because you can also get a very good rate through Western Union, but the currency exchange rate is just so different. And when I spoke with expats who has been in Argentina for like decades, they were saying when they first arrived, the US dollar to the Argentinian peso was 1-to-1. Now it's like, I don't know, now it's like 1 to like
Now it's
some
hundreds.
crazy
Yeah.
amount.
I was
Yeah,
just
so
there actually in March and early April. And yeah, it was insane. If you got the official rate, like if you used a credit card, it was roughly 100 to the dollar. And if you went to the blue rate, exchange your cash, it was 200. And now it's even worse. It's like 150, 300 or something. But it kind of boggles your mind, because you think, oh, I'm going to take money out of the ATM and go do my thing, pay with a debit card or whatever. No, you don't want to do any of that. You need to have cash.
yeah, and you feel very rich in Argentina because like you're holding this like freaking huge stack of cash,
Yeah.
because you can't use your card because the card uses the official rate, and you can't withdraw
Right.
from the ATM because they charge you, and there's like a super low limit that you can withdraw at any one time. So it makes
And
no
even
sense
Uber,
whatsoever.
like you don't think about that, but Uber's through your apps. So you're getting the official rate. But if you take a regular taxi, you pay cash.
Yeah, so there's like a lot of, I think when you travel, you start traveling around the region, there are things that you just suddenly realize are like, you just don't expect it. If you are coming from like a more developed or first world country, you'll be like, what is this? Like, what's this weird thing that's happening here? So it always pays to like do a bit of research before you start diving in, and then you realize that, hey, there's some like different things here.
Yeah, and see if you could find out when that article was written if you're looking at prices on something, because it changes a lot over the years because of the exchange rate. And there's a website, I can't remember what it's called, but just Google historic exchange rate, and it'll show you over the years, how it has changed. And like Brazil too is crazy. I mean, there was a time when Brazil was the most expensive country in the Americas, like including the US and Canada. It was just ridiculously expensive. And now it's, a bargain again. And it's all because of where the exchange rate is. And I mean, it never should have been that expensive to start with. It was like a bubble thing, but yeah, it makes a big difference. And like right now, Thailand's pretty reasonable, but there have been other times when the exchange rate has been way more unfavorable than it is right now. And that can have a big impact on everything you're spending money on.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think one of the recent example is the fall of the euros compared to the dollars, right? So if you actually come from the States, Europe is technically supposedly a cheaper destination now compared to like a year or two ago, because the exchange rate for the dollars is so much stronger compared to the euros now. So there was this dilemma when I think about it. I'm like, now it's a bit more expensive to travel, but then with the exchange rate, it seems like a good deal to go there. And I think I was getting a notification on my like those finance wallet apps that the Japanese yen is now also at its all-time low. So Japan is by right also like cheaper to travel. And I know a few years back, the lira was like extremely low as well. So these are certain things that I think people can look at when they are trying to like figure out where to go,
Yeah, and that's important too. If a place was on your bucket list, as they say, if it's someplace you always wanted to go, like if you always wanted to go check out the temples in Kyoto in Japan, then this would be the year to do it when they finally open back up. Because first of all, it's never been this cheap if you have dollars or you're earning dollars, but also things are probably going to be reasonably priced because they haven't had any tourists for 2 years.
Yeah, I think a lot of businesses are like kind of desperate for some. Those that have not opened up are definitely desperate for some clients and new income coming in, right? And also, I tend to like traveling more in the off seasons, or even sometime in like the total winter season. I think that is another way to kind of avoid the tourist crowds, especially if you're going to the hot spots, because those really hot spots are still going to be like crowded, but they won't be as crowded as like the summertime craze.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we talked about Prague earlier, and Barcelona, Amsterdam, all those places that are crazy crowded in the summer. They get a lot less crowded when the weather cools down.
Yeah, I remember spending like even February in Rome, and that was still insane for me. I was like, this sucks, man. I mean, like, I was still very amazed at the structures and the history and culture that there, but then the vibe was really like, as long as you're within that tourist zone, everywhere you turn is just hordes of people. And Feb is not even like the summer season. That's already considered shoulder season, I would say, the start of the shoulder season. That was still insane. Prague was relatively okay in, I think, when was I there? December or January. It was still acceptable. I think that was great. So now I'm always looking at like, maybe sometimes it's best to just go for if you're not looking to do activities, like if you want to go to the beach or if you want to go hiking in certain places, then obviously the weather matters. But if you're not that sort of traveler, if you're looking more at just doing like, especially city travel, I think when you travel in the off season, you get a more local vibe. And the people are friendlier as well, because they are not as busy. They're not like in the restaurants, they're not crazy trying to serve and change tables and stuff. So they tend to talk to you more about their things as well. So that's a very interesting experience. And you can also go to the hostels and just walk in and still get a place.
Yeah.
Whereas in the summer, you just can't. You're paying like 2-3 times the price, and then you have to book early. And then you're still, maybe if you're in dorm, you're in the full dorm,
Right.
So the type of travelers I think you experience are also a bit different in the different seasons.
And you also brought up something that maybe you don't need to spend more than 2 days in Rome. And I think you said you traveled like that a lot anyway. But, a lot of those big popular cities, just see the big sights and then move on. You could probably go 2 hours by train to some place where there's only going to be 10 foreigners in town in February, instead of thousands still.
Yeah. So these are definitely some tips that the listeners can look at when they're planning their trips. So let's conclude with some quick fire questions about your travel experiences. Starting with, where's your favorite travel destination so far after 30 plus years of travel?
Well, I live in Mexico, so obviously I like that place a lot, and I've traveled around there a lot. I've been to Peru 5 or 6 times. That's one of my favorites. I've been to Nepal a few times. I really like it there once you get out of the cities, because they're pretty nasty. But the mountains are fantastic. I tend to like places with mountains a lot. I do like the beach, but I get bored after a while, and I like being in mountain places better. But it's always hard to pick, because, it changes every year depending on where you've been. Like I was just in Patagonia in Argentina, and it was fantastic. If somebody asked me where I would like to go back to tomorrow, and I could just beam myself there, Star Trek style, I would love to go back and see more of what I missed. But that's a tough one. My joke answer that I give people is like, wherever I'm going next, that's my favorite place. It just depends.
Yeah, Patagonia is definitely amazing. I spent months there, and you still can't see everything, because the nature is just so vast. Yeah. So there's always stuff to do there. What's the 3 most useful items in your travel bag, apart from the laptop and handphone, obviously?
Yeah, a lot of stuff's work related, so I'm not going to count that. I've got a little pouch that I put all my gadgets in, and that kind of thing is always useful. It's good to have some kind of organizer. When I travel to places that you can't drink the water, I usually bring a Sterapin, which is one of those UV light purifiers, because it doesn't take up much room, and you can use it almost anywhere. But I mean, I think I don't pack exactly the same for every trip, because a lot of it depends on climate and where I'm going and everything. But I'm challenged in the hair department, so I need a good hat. So my sun hat's probably the most important thing I bring, because otherwise I'm going to be in trouble. But I also use a hanging toiletry kit. That's something I've been using ever since I first started traveling, and I still use it. Because you don't always have much counter space, but you always got a place you can hang a toiletry kit. And related to that, also one thing I've been using since the very first day I went traveling, was one of those cloth wallets that your belt goes through and then you can shove it under your pants,
Yep.
because then there's no way somebody's pickpocketing you if you've got that on.
Yeah, that's definitely important, especially if you are into like the hot spots or if you are into nightlife and stuff. I think that comes really handy at night, especially when you're like half drunk and walking around.
Right,
It's
of
best to have
course,
something
yeah.
like that. Okay. And the last question, let's summarize what we have spoke about, right? If a traveler wants to travel like cheap or make the best bang for bucks, what do you think are the three most important points to take note of in order to achieve that?
Well, first of all, go to the clusters where there's a bunch of cheap countries next to each other. And Southeast Asia is the classic one. You got, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, Malaysia, and then you can go on a boat or a cheap flight to Indonesia. And so once you land in Bangkok or Kuala Lumpur or whatever, you can explore all those countries for cheap, and you could spend a year there just in that area if you wanted. India and Nepal are right next to each other. You took that train in between. So that's a good cluster too. There's clusters in Central America and South America. And so if you go to those places, you only have to have one expensive across the ocean flight, and then you can explore a lot of places. So that makes a lot of sense. And then also, travel slowly, as we said. I've met people that have this round the world itinerary where they're trying to go to 20 or 25 different countries, and that's just insane. Like, save some of it for later. It won't be your only trip. So just don't try to do everything on one trip, and slow down a little bit, and you'll have more memorable experiences. And last thing, this is just a little hack thing, but get some kind of debit card where you're not going to get charged huge fees every time you take out money, because you're going to be taking out money every few days or every week at least. And so those fees can really add up. And same thing with credit cards. You want ones with no transaction fees and that are hopefully giving you something back, airline points or hotel points, or if nothing else, at least cash back, but make sure you're getting something out of it.
Yeah, for sure. The last point was important because I think as it came obvious to me because I think it came obvious to us because we travel a lot, but I realized a lot of people are just spending with a normal credit card, and then they get that 3% or that 1%, and then the withdrawal fees and whatever things. But I would say the new trend that came up in the last few years was all these what do we call it? The fintech companies that are launching cards. So like Revolut, Wise, or used to be called TransferWise.
Mm-hmm.
These are very popular cards among nomads these days because it might not give you like the cashback or the points, but they cut down on all the fees. So you get a better currency exchange rate. And then I think most of them, you have a free withdrawal amount overseas for a certain limited amount per month. So if you have like 2 or 3 of these cards, then it's easy. And especially if you are those that are worried about overspending on a credit card because the money don't just gets out, try to use those are all debit cards, which means that you have to top up or something like that, so you can control your spendings. So I think that is like a very good area.
And if you're coming from an advanced place like US or Singapore or parts of Europe, you might think, oh, I'll travel around the world with my cards and I won't need to use cash, but that's definitely not true. A lot of countries are still very cash oriented.
Oh yeah, that's for sure. That's something to definitely think about. I was quite surprised when I came back to Singapore and certain places still don't take like credit cards. So we have like an easy payment system of like a local, I think we call it Pay Now, whereby it's a digital wallet, but it's only used within Singapore, and like many countries have their version of it. But before that, I was in Europe, and Europe takes a lot more card, especially Western Europe. Right. So I was quite surprised when I couldn't pay with cards because I haven't set up the digital wallets. I was like, oh, that's interesting.
And one thing related to that, make sure you got a backup or two also, because you lose a card or it gets eaten by the machine or you forget to take it or whatever. And so you don't want to be stuck, waiting for somebody to ship a credit card to you in Luang Prabang or something. It's easier if you're a couple. Yeah, it's easier for a couple because you can sort of back each other up, but you ideally want to have more than one credit card and maybe more than one debit card just in case.
Yeah, and store them in different places.
Yeah, different places. I know somebody that got their laptop bag stolen, and they had their passport in there and all their credit cards, and they had been backing up their photos onto a hard drive, but it was in the same bag as their laptop. It's like, what were you thinking?
So I got my room broken into in Peru, and I think some of the listeners might have heard of this story before. I got my room broken into in Cusco, and then basically the thief took the laptop and stuff. But I had my stuff stored in different places. But one thing is that usually if you're in developing countries, they look at the two typical things. One is anything that's cash-based. The other thing is electronics. So you want to make sure that you store things separate from your electronics and your cash. So for example, like I have a credit card in my underwear bag, right? Like the thief is not going to take the underwear bag. It's just so stupid, right? So, but some of the stuff that I put together with like my electronics that were not valuable, they also got stolen because they just took the whole bag, right? So you want to kind of strategically decide where you want to place your stuff in the different places. But usually when people steal something, it's usually looked at either the wallet or the electronics.
Right. And then they're probably not going to take your big giant backpack with all your clothes in it. So you can put some of your backup cards in there, maybe some backup cash, because they don't want that. You can't sell
it. Yeah, fortunately. So thanks, Tim, for coming on today. There was a lot of tips that we talk about, although it was quite unorganized the way I try and like list it. But I'm sure the listeners listen through the whole conversation, they will get the tips, and then you can listen again if they want to get it clearer. But you have a lot of tips yourself on your websites and your books, right? So how can people keep track of the stuff that you're doing, and where do they get like tap on your knowledge of travel?
Well, the best place related to all this that we've been talking about is the Cheapest Destinations blog. That's kind of related to my book. I've been running it for a really long time. But otherwise, if you just remember my name, timleffel.com is my address that like links out to everything else. And then my books are available at Amazon and Kobo and those kind of places. So yeah, my name's not very common, so I'm pretty easy to find on social media and things like that.
Awesome. Yeah, I would tag the blog and your social media stuff. And I think you have 2 websites at least, right? One is your
I have newsletters you can sign up to, and I won't bug you very much. It's usually once or twice a month.
Yeah, that's the Nomadico newsletter, right?
Yeah, I just started doing that with Kevin Kelly and this other guy, Mark, a few months ago. And that's just 4 quick tips every week that will hopefully make your travel work life easier.
Oh, nice.
Or more fruitful. Yeah, just it doesn't take long to get through. It's not a very long newsletter.
Awesome. So I think a lot of people are trying to transit to remote work will probably find that useful to get some tips on how to bring your work on the road. Awesome. So I'll link that in as well on where they can sign up. And thank you, Tim, for coming on today and sharing your knowledge. And it was a very nice chat.
Well, thanks for having me on, Rex. It was fun to talk about our travels, and hopefully some more people will get out there on the road now that we don't have all these restrictions.